back to the voters and seek approval. Change your plan, go back to the voters, and let the voters decide.
Indeed. I attempted that in 2012 with legislation at the time called SB 985 in California to place that back in front of the voters, give people the option, now that they have more information, to say, do they really want to go through this with California's other issues? You mentioned, Mr. Denham, the challenges we've had with water supply. Even our governor is saying that this is a huge priority, a huge problem for California faced in 2014. And yet we have a very difficult time allocating a few $billion to enhance our water storage in California. Instead, are faced with this. What would that mean for jobs in the valley if we're able to turn the tap back on to agriculture at a fraction of the price of high-speed rail? I yield to my friend.
It would be a fraction of the price. Tens of thousands of jobs that will be lost by seeing farmland that goes by without being planted this year. We have a huge drought. There are huge issues. And what everybody is trying to say is a high-speed rail. Keep in mind, this initial segment, this initial operating segment, which has a $20 billion funding gap, is not going to be electrified. It will not be high speed. By their numbers, by their plan, this is another set of track that will not be electrified, that will run as is being run today, with a $20 billion gap. So even if you came up with the entire $32 billion of this initial segment, we are still stuck in the same situation that we are. We're just that much further in the hole. Now, I know some of my colleagues would say, well, just spend the money as quick as you can. Let's just spend some of it, and like other projects, once you've started it, someday the money will come. I don't think we can deal with that type of pie-in-the-sky rhetoric. I believe we've got to have a full funding plan that makes sense. One that has a private investor that was promised to us. You know, we've heard several times that if you just write the legislation, we'll have a private investor. If you just put it on the ballot and approve it by the legislature, before it actually goes to the voters, we will have private investors that will sign on to this. Then it was right after the ballot passed. We have nearly $10 billion committed to by the taxpayers. For sure, we're going to have a private investor now. 5 years later, after the federal government has come up with several $billion, after the voters are now on the hook for $10 billion, and still today, there is no private investor. You'd be a fool to invest in this. This isn't Florida's project. This isn't Texas's project. This is a project with a huge funding gap that's still not going to be electrified by their plan. I yield back.
Indeed. When we looked at the project in totality here, what ended up being $100 billion to be legal under Proposition 1A, to have a true high-speed rail, which is required to go from San Francisco to L.A. at a high speed, 2 hours and 40 minutes. A $100 billion project was revised now down to a $68 billion project, which does not include high speed all the way to San Francisco in the north. It would stop at San Jose area, and then you're required to use local transportation, local light rail, what have you, to get all the way up to San Francisco. And at the southern end, you have in L.A. County, it doesn't go to downtown Los Angeles under the new plan. It would stop somewhere in the remote North L.A. County portion. And so it isn't truly high-speed rail anymore. As you mentioned, too, Mr. Denham, on that, if they take the Palmdale route, they probably can't even sustain those speeds. So it's illegal in that count that it probably can't make a 2-hour and 40-minute ride. And with that, you have 3 different segments. So if you have to buy 3 different tickets, I don't know how the customers are being suited by 3 different stops like that as well. We were told back in the day that the price of the ticket would somehow be tied to 85% of what an airline ticket was to go from north to south or south to north. And a real estimate, if this was self-sustaining, would be somewhere maybe triple of that. So the impacts of that, again, California agriculturally with water supply is struggling this year. And so for the fraction of the amount of money it would take to bolster California's storage, we're going to spend perhaps what would have been $100 billion and the revised number, $68 billion, to do an illegal Prop 1A version from South San Jose to North Los Angeles. That's a $55 billion gap on the entire project right there. We can only point to $13 billion worth of funding. The 9.9 from the bond, which bonds have consequences. They have to be paid back by an already financially strapped state. As well, the $3.5 billion or so that's promised from the federal government under the 2009 stimulus has strings too. It has an expiration period. Please embellish on that a little bit, Mr. Denham, on that, because we know there's some very important deadlines coming on that as well, if we can.
There are important deadlines, and again, this is part of the Anti-Deficiency Act that says that the 50-50 match now is coming due for the state. So April 1, $180 million is due. The question is for the governor, where is that money going to come from? We can't just continue to change deadlines. And the question to the administration is, are you going to continue to allow California not to guarantee its matching funds? I mean, it is going against the Anti-Deficiency Act, the reason that is put into law.
California just passed a recent tax known as Prop 30 last year, 2012, that was going to pay for a whole lot of things, go for a lot of different measures with perhaps schools, other infrastructure. We had talked about cap and trade. We've also, you can even point to truck fees, that they're all now trying to be shifted towards high-speed rail instead of other priorities. I wonder if that's what the voters' intentions were on Prop 30 or on their truck fees or weight fees, etc. So I think there's been a lot of deception around this, again, on cost, on ridership. As I mentioned a minute ago, if it's been revised down to a $68 billion plan, and we can only point to, for sure, approximately $13 billion from Fed stimulus and the state bond, where does the other $55 billion go to build what is really an illegal plan? Where's it going to come from? You know, Mr. Denham, you mentioned we haven't seen the private sector money from anywhere. Yet you can point to, recently, a proposal came out for an East Coast plan to build a maglev, magnetic levitation train, that would link East Coast urban centers. And there's already interested investors from Japan on that, with much more modern technology. You could say that rail, this really isn't new technology because it's wheels still running on a steel rail. And in California, which is supposed to lead the way in technology and innovation, we're really not leading on this at all. So what do you see as far as the problems with that bigger funding gap, and then bringing that back to what's that going to do for our economy?
Well, certainly we're falling way behind the rest of the world. You know, other technologies are starting to flourish in other parts of the world, yet here this project will take at least 30 years, but more likely 50 to 60 based on where they're currently standing on the project. So something that will be far outdated technology if it ever gets completed. But the real question is on the funding. Where is the commitment? I mean, this president certainly could look for or come up with other money. He could propose other money to fulfill this project. Not even Democrats will support that. That's not a Republican issue. This is an issue across the nation saying, why would we come up with money when we're starved across the nation to throw at a project in California that is being mismanaged? And I think that there are real questions there, not only for the administration, but private investors that are not willing to sink money into a failing project. They don't know what they're on the hook for. They don't know how long of a commute this will be or what the ridership numbers will ever be. Even by this entire plan, there are too many stops, whether you talk to the rail authority or whether you talk to investors around the world. With that many stops in those locations, you will never get to the 220-mile-an-hour speed. You will never get to 2 hours and 40 minutes. This thing is full of holes. Makes no sense for voters, and voters should have a say-so on whether or not they're going to commit any money, initial money, or any further money as we move forward. This is about our future. Not yours and mine, but our kids, our grandkids, and the type of debt that we saddle them with. And at a certain point, I think that not only Californians, but Americans need to wake up and say whether or not this is a project that deserves an investment. And can we do things smarter? Can we do things like Florida and Texas And I don't think Florida and Texas are going to be alone. I think that there will be other states that step up and find ways to do high-speed rail, find ways to make a common-sense solution in their states. But in this state, this project is flawed. It's initially flawed by $20 billion, but certainly by more than $55 billion if we decide to move forward. At a certain point, you have to ask, how much is enough? I would say that now is enough.
Thank you. Indeed, when the stimulus money first started coming available, there was other states that applied for high-speed rail money, such as Florida, Ohio, and Wisconsin, I believe, that had, after they looked at their numbers, ran the figures on projects that were eligible for that stimulus money, they turned that money back and went back into this pool. Of course, California said it wants it, but interesting, that would have been a much smaller portion had California been sharing with those other states of what federal money would have come to the state. So the other one said, we've looked at the numbers and we're turning that money back in. So I think we ought to apply some of the same logic as the other states looked at when they had federal money available, eligible funds, that they indeed turned back. So well, I really appreciate your leadership on this, Congressman Denham, on this, and we will be doing a lot more to make sure that this is held accountable to the public here, and look forward to your hearing tomorrow on this matter. So, so thank you.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yield.
We're also joined by a colleague from the lower San Joaquin Valley area of the state, who this issue is very important, very key to his district as well, on the impact of the rail route, as well as the economy, as well as what it means for the taxpayers of the state and of the entire country. Indeed, this has an effect on national taxpayers and the budget as well. So there's got to be people in the other 49 states looking at what's going on here, saying, why is our federal money going into something that can't possibly work out? And so I know we're all willing to help people in other states with sensible infrastructure projects. That's the way it works in this country with our interstate system that President Eisenhower had the vision for back in the day. And yeah, there might have been naysayers there, but you could actually point to positive results and something that works long term, and other infrastructure projects that were invested in. But this one here, the numbers just don't run. And so my colleague David Valadeo from the Valley, he's got very great concerns, has been very strong and leading in his area too as well on what are the impacts going to be, what are the costs. And so I'd like to recognize Congressman David Valadeo. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman, rice farmer from Northern California, for the opportunity to speak here today. Where do you start with something like this? I grew up a dairy farmer in Kings County and continue to be a dairy farmer in Kings County to this day. I spent my first 2 years in elected office in California State Legislature on a budget subcommittee and watched as this project moved along. And right before election, when this was passed back in '08 and up until my election in 2010, the project didn't seem that bad. It seemed like something that was just voted on and put on the shelf, and they would continue to build on it. And at the last minute, some money showed up, and it basically put this project in high gear. And the project wasn't ready for it. And like the congressman from the northern part of the valley mentioned earlier, there was no real plan. When you show up at the last minute and say, here's some money, start building right away, as if it's shovel ready, it set this project up for a really, really tough time. What we're facing now today, we see a train system being built, a high-speed rail, and like was mentioned earlier, older technology. 40 years ago, rail with wheels was the technology. Nowadays, maglev is the new technology. And so to see a project that's starting today with technology that's already 40 years old, that probably won't be running for another 30 years, I think we're setting ourselves up for failure. And when you look at what else has been going on with this project as far as what the opportunities are, when you look at my district specifically, California District 21, you've got communities like Hanford, Corcoran, Wasco, who all rely on a system that we've got today, Amtrak, which Amtrak doesn't really pay its bills, but it gets people from A to B, and it serves its purpose. You've got a system there where people that live in those communities are able to get to the doctor in Fresno, or get to the doctor in Bakersfield, or get to work, but a small commuter train that gets them where they need to be for relatively low cost. You look at high-speed rail, and as the map was up on the screen earlier shows, what we've got there is a track that will basically pass from Hanford, if Hanford ever gets built, but for sure Fresno to Bakersfield, and it leaves all the people in California 21 basically out to dry. And that's sad. I mean, when you see a project that was supposed to help those less fortunate or those people that need the most, you've got a project now that's actually going to hurt them and put potentially at risk the Amtrak they've got today, their mode of transportation. And because this project lacks so much money, that's why it puts us in that position. We've got a system in place that's built on someone else's train tracks, on Burlington Northern's train tracks in my area. I'm sure it goes on to other tracks in other parts of the state. And if the project that they've got today starts to move forward and they run out of money like we expect them to, part of the plan is to move Amtrak over there. So what happens to those stations in my district? I mean, that's just one of the issues I see. And then California 21, like mentioned earlier, and a good portion of the valley, we face a water shortage, a drought. And some of that is natural, but a lot of that is regulatory. And we've also got a severe lack of infrastructure to deliver water. I mean, we've got Temperance Flat, we've got Sykes Reservoir, we've got a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built, and that's infrastructure that would benefit not just California, but the whole state in general. When you look at a project like the high-speed rail, if that project was to go forward and to be built, you'd have a high-speed rail that most people couldn't afford to ride. If you build water infrastructure, you've now got water to grow a product, water to feed families, water for our communities. And once you have that, you start to grow crops, you start to produce products, you start to improve an economy and produce a product that you actually can sell and bring dollars back in your community. And that, in my opinion, makes a lot more sense. Then education. California struggled with funding for education for years. We've seen plenty of programs were cut out, cut back, or just flat out gotten rid of. And if you've got a project like high-speed rail spending money when they're not prepared for it, when you should be investing in our future, education, making sure our kids have the best opportunities, the best foundation to improve our economy, to be good, productive members of our society, and to make a real difference. I think education should be our first priority. You look at everything that we could be spending money on. Right now in California, we've been letting prisoners out of prison because we don't have money to build facilities for them, because we don't have enough money to keep some of the community correctional facilities open. There's a lot going on there, and we have to be spending money on a project like this when we should be focusing on something that helps keep our communities safe. I mean, those are all things that we should be paying attention to that we're not because of this project. And they're in a hurry to build this project right now because they say it creates jobs. But like was alluded earlier, or was pointed out earlier, those numbers were all bogus. They were sold, they were pushed up, they weren't honest numbers, and we're starting to see this project that will put our children, our grandchildren into debt for a long time for a small amount of jobs that we really can't account for. We really can't even assure are going to be our own community jobs, or if they're going to come from our own district. So this is something that's had me concerned my whole time in the legislature. It's something that I've talked about for a long time, and it's something that I'm going to continue to fight. It's something that needs to be talked about, needs to be pushed out there. And the more people that get involved, you take groups like my Kings County group of residents who have sued the state and have sued the federal government over this project. When they first got involved, they looked at this project and said, well, this is going to affect our families, this is going to affect our homes, let's fight it. Once they started getting into the details and to see where the funding was coming from, or the lack of funding, or how this plan was being pushed forward, and the amount of deceit that goes into this project just to get it rammed down our throats, they decided to keep fighting it no matter what. Even though the alignment was moved off of their property across town to another part of town, they thought, or the High-Speed Rail Authority thought, oh, these people will back off now because it doesn't affect them personally. But once they knew what was really in this project and what was being run down their throats, they said, there's no way we can let this fight go. So the group actually grew. Now that the new constituents were affected by the new alignment, the old guys came in and the new guys joined together, and the group grew. Now they moved the alignment back, and the same group is still fighting. The first group is continuing to fight, and the second group is in it as well. It's just amazing how the more you get to know about this project, and how it's being pushed and how it's being run, the more you want to fight it, the more you want to shut this thing down. And so, just to close, California high-speed rail comes at a tremendous cost to taxpayers while delivering no benefit to my constituents. This project will destroy homes and businesses throughout California's 21st Congressional District and divert precious tax dollars away from water infrastructure, public safety, and education. I will continue to uphold my promise to my constituents and do whatever I have in my power to stop this project as fast as possible. So, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Valadale. I had just one comment or one question, see if you might comment on that as well. A commission, a board in California recently moved, it's a 3-person board, to authorize the rail authority to start condemning property under eminent domain. And of course there's going to be a lot of resistance. I know Kings County is an area that's like a hotbed of resistance to this project here. The eminent domain procedures aren't always easy, they're not always very cheap to get through a court process. So they've already moved to condemn 2 pieces of property, I believe in Fresno County, and I believe there's at least 380 that might have to go through this process. How do your constituents feel about the forced taking of land and an alignment that doesn't make a lot of sense, and some of the infrastructure that might be lost in these communities?
You know, over the years, there's been a lot of things built in the valley, freeways, just different things that obviously need to be built for the good of the state. And farmers and constituents in general, if they understand why it's being taken and it makes sense for the state, usually it's an easy deal. But once they get involved in the details of this project and start to see how they're being treated themselves, how the project is going to end up looking, because it's pretty apparent with the lack of funding and with the rest of the federal government looking at this project and understanding that it's pretty much ruined now because of the management, they're not happy. They're fighting this thing tooth and nail. And then when it comes down to their own personal property, obviously they're offended with some of the prices and some of the numbers they've been seeing. If they own the property, or if their families owned it, if it's a generational thing, or just in general as an eyesore that'll be running alongside of their homes, affecting how they drive to work or how they move around the district in general. But it's just offensive to many of them, just depending on the different route or how you want to approach it.
Indeed. Let me ask you too, how easy is it to relocate a rendering plant? Of course, we know a rendering plant is the areas that the facility that processes dead agricultural animals, which happens, and so they need to be taken somewhere to be processed, and one of those is right in your district, I understand. So, well,
we've got a rendering plant that is right in the middle of the alignment as the alignment is today. Obviously the alignment moves on a weekly basis, so you're never really sure, but the rendering plant has been in the line in the alignments twice now. The first time, and we're back in there again. As far as permitting for a new rendering plant, back in '06 during the heat wave, we struggled in the Central Valley to handle all the amount of animals that were needing to be processed at that time. And permitting for a new facility was nearly impossible, and we were never able to upgrade or expand the facilities. So to actually build a new one today, I would say, is nearly impossible.
Is the High-Speed Rail Authority out there guaranteeing to help or see through as part of the environmental documents to help make sure this is replaced, or other infrastructure? You know, there's dairies in line there that, you know, again, in California, securing a permit for a new dairy has become nearly an impossibility, as my colleague in the dairy business would probably report. And so there's a lot of people weighing in on that. So relocating the dairy, you know, these are facilities and lands that have been in generations of families that have been there. And so is anything being taken into account on the authority helping with these processes as part of their impact they're having?
We have got no guarantees on any of that. Some of the things that affect some of our constituents, obviously someone that might have a restaurant that the high-speed rail goes through their property, they go in and they give them what they assume is the value of that, but no one ever takes into account replacement value. Or someone that might own a home. They purchased their home when the prices were high, they bought their first home, now prices have come down, and this is an opportunity for someone for high-speed rail to come in and offer them market price, which would basically leave that person homeless and in debt. So there's a lot of situations. We've got farmers who have long-time leases on property who do not own the property but own the permanent crop on top of that. High-speed rail hasn't taken into account the value of that crop on top, and people will invest $10,000 to $15,000 an acre to get trees planted, and if they're only buying the land for what the value of the land is but not what is on top of that land, that obviously will put a lot of people upside down in a really bad position and affect a lot of jobs. And one of the biggest economic drivers in the valley and in California, we export a lot of ag products, and that brings a lot of dollars in. So that obviously will have an impact on our economy as well.
Indeed. We're both from long-time farming families, and I think when you are a farmer, or anybody in a small business that might be multi-generational, but especially on the land, you develop a bond, you develop a love of the land that you don't really put a price on. You know, I think most farmers, they'll farm until they can't farm anymore, either due to age or regulations taking it away from them or whatever. And so how do you put a price on, you know, in my family, we're raised in the 5th generation, and you and your neighbors, you have multi-generations as well. How do you put a market price on your legacy? You know, somebody coming in from Sacramento or Washington, whatever, saying, we think it's worth that. It might be worth an infinitely more amount to you and your family and the generations behind you that might like that. How do you quantify that, Dave?
Well, you can't. And when it's a project that's necessary for the benefit of the country, benefit of the state, one that actually makes sense with a good plan behind it, it's a little easier to swallow. But when you see this project in general and how big of a disaster it's been and how little information has been given out to the public, how they plan on funding it, how they plan on moving forward, if people are going to be able to afford to actually ride this thing, it really makes it just that much worse, because this is important. I mean, when you look at how hard some people have worked to build their homes, to build their farms, to build their companies. I mean, we've got restaurants, we've got a little bit of everything that's being affected by this. And you see their blood, sweat, and tears. You can't put a price on that.
Certainly. Eminent domain is something that government should use very reluctantly, very rarely, only when there's no other option available. And, you know, my farm's been affected by that as well with the large towers, the power lines that move basically from hydroelectric projects in the northeast part of the state down to San Francisco Bay Area. So, you know, it's something that affects our fields, but it's part of the greater good. And, you know, our tractors have to drive around those now and figure out how to still keep straight lines going through towers running at an angle, and you have ag aircraft that has to tangle with avoiding wires and flying over the towers at 200 feet trying to drop seed or fertilizer, things like that. And so we get some pretty strange streaks in our fields because of that infrastructure, but it's important. You know, we want the folks in the Bay Area to have that. And so, but eminent domain isn't always very fair, and what I'm seeing here is that the promises made by, well, there isn't any promises made by the High-Speed Rail Authority to truly keep people whole on this and give them options. As you mentioned, the alignment changes frequently. We're not even sure if they have a full 520-mile alignment decided yet, and they could have gone for a more low-impact route with perhaps putting it down the middle of Interstate 5 or adjacent to it, using parts of 99 perhaps. But
or maybe fill in gaps where Amtrak doesn't serve today. Currently, if you want to go from Bakersfield to LA, you get on a bus. There's no connection there. That would have been a great place to start this project. And that's one of the arguments we have. When you've got a project of this size and such a small percentage of the money that is needed to build this project, you can see the failure coming. But you have to make sure that whatever resources are spent in a way that benefits the overall majority of the people. And right now, if you're riding Amtrak from Fresno to LA and you get off at Bakersfield and you get on that Greyhound bus and ride over the hill, I'm sure Greyhound does a great job, but that would be a great place to fill in the hole and actually build a rail and build it up to today's standards and put something in place that we can build on in the future that makes sense.
Certainly. You can make an argument that the first places you should look are the urban areas where you could have the potential ridership. You know, here on the East Coast you have a lot of ridership between Washington, D.C. on up all the way to Boston. Mm-hmm. And I don't know about the financial you know, viability of that, but at least you can make a case there. And here, you know, as was reported just a couple years ago, they wanted to start in the valley because, as was quoted, they had the least amount of resistance to building the rail starting in the rural valley, as opposed to what it was going to take to run through the South Bay area, places like Palo Alto and others that some people are feverishly opposed to what that would do and what that infrastructure tends to bring to high-value communities like that as well. So, but again, the promise lies in the Central Valley for us in what we do well already. My portion in northern Sacramento Valley, San Joaquin Valley, you know, these are strong agricultural areas. So I'm wondering, maybe you could touch on this as well. We've had different ideas for water projects that for a fraction of the money we're talking about with a high-speed rail system, how far could we go to do 1 or 2 water storage projects, and what would that mean for especially communities like you have down there that have seen a huge economic impact with the cutoff of water due to the delta smelt and those other problems? What would that mean in real jobs for the people that have the skills and education level that likely aren't going to be working on a high-speed rail project but have a strong background in agriculture? What do you see that doing to help your area?
Well, when we look at a company that wants to invest in the valley, if they're in agriculture, obviously they're attracted to the area for those reasons. But if they're looking for an affordable place that makes sense between LA and San Francisco because of access to larger populations, they look at the Central Valley, but they also want to make sure that there's security there. If you're going to build a company, you want to make sure it's in a great place for your employees. And I think the focus should be right now making sure that people have affordable energy to live there, because obviously it gets hot in the summer. And the water situation, are you going to move your family into an area where the water isn't safe to drink, which is commonplace in some of those communities that we've been fighting for funding for some of the water treatment facilities that are so necessary. And then when you get into the infrastructure itself, if you're going to build a plant or anything or a processing facility for the type of commodities we grow, water is a necessity. And it starts from growing the crop to cleaning the crop to making sure that the facilities are up to code and that we've got some treatment in place, that we have a product that we can sell and bring dollars in those communities. And that's how you create jobs. That's the right way to do it. And that's something that we should be focusing on and investing our limited resources on today. Obviously, we've been making some really tough decisions in the last few months over spending and budgets and everything else that we've got going on, not just in the national level, but at the state level. There's going to be some tough decisions as well. Those decisions should be based on priorities, and those priorities should be making sure that we have the resources. And resources today mean water. Water is the #1 priority, and that's where it should be focused at.
I think everybody in California in the midst of this drought would probably find agreement with that. You know, our own governor was underlining that in a speech the other day, and so yet still wedded to this high-speed rail project, which the funding is highly questionable. Indeed, a judge handed down a decision the other day ordering California not to spend any of the state bond money because it wouldn't be legal to do so under the lack of a plan they have. So, you know, we both served in the state legislature, and is California's financial situation such that it can get out there on its own somehow with new funding if the federal money falls short or no private investment comes out? Where will it come from?
Well, we've got a lot of priorities here in Washington, D.C., and the different members from different parts of the state are not looking at California's high-speed rail project the way it's being rolled out today and thinking that's a good place to invest the resources that the taxpayers in their district want to see them spend the money on. So it's not going to be an easy lift, and as this project seems to move forward and the press gets worse and worse, and when you've got judges involved saying that they're not following the letter of the law, what was asked of the voters when they voted for it, it just makes it that much harder to come up with the rest of the money they're going to need to finish this project. So to get it started, just to build a big berm, or maybe even a berm with some metal on top to hopefully throw some older style Amtrak trains on top, doesn't make a lot of sense, especially when you're going to cut off communities that need it today, need what we've got in place today, and not put that in jeopardy.
Yeah, what doesn't get talked about much are different impacts like a high-speed rail. In order to sustain a high speed, you've got to build it a very long elliptical form in order to make turns with a train going 220 miles per hour. And so that doesn't, it's kind of like the angled towers running at angled lines on my property that we farm. It doesn't fit in real well with a grid that's set up on straight lines and squares like that. So when a elliptical-shaped rail comes through your community through agricultural zones, as well as high-speed rail having to cut off all the crossings. Can you build enough overpasses to not have stop the flow of traffic, whether that's cars or trucks or even a farmer on a tractor who now may have to drive his tractor instead of just across 6 miles down the road and back up to get around? I mean, there's a lot of impacts that are really not meeting the eye here when you line them out.
Like I mentioned earlier, when this project was started, it was started as a long-term project. But then $3 billion showed up from the federal government, and the project managers are basically said, put this thing in high gear, start breaking ground. You've got a project of this size that affects so many people in so many different communities, how they travel around their homes to work, around their farms, around their businesses, transporting products between warehouses and processing facilities. And there's so much going on, and you've got this project now that's going to disrupt all of that just because they've got a timeline that they've got to spend. And the timeline is really on a small portion of it. We're talking a couple percentage of the total cost of the project. I mean, it's not worth risking a project of this size over such a small amount of money. And that's probably one of the worst things that's happened in this project since its inception. It could have been something great. It could have been a project that could have made a big difference if it was given the time to be designed and planned in a way that benefited the state, didn't burden the state with debt forever, and actually helped the constituents of that state. So it's too bad this project has gone down the path it has. But again, we're going to try to stop this thing so that this doesn't happen and doesn't affect our communities.
Yeah, well, and indeed it does appear that they're hell-bent on spending that approximately $3.5 billion that has federal deadlines on it in order to get the project started. And then at that point, well, we're invested in the project, we can't stop now, even though the judge ruled it's illegal to spend the state dollars because it's not fulfilling the plan. So indeed, big impact on the Valley and on taxpayers. So, Mr. Valadeo, I really appreciate your time and your leadership on this here tonight, and let's keep putting the message out that there's better ways. Most anything might be better than investing in this at this point. So I thank you for your help here tonight.
Thank you. I yield back.
So indeed, the investors that were supposed to come in, private investment for what had been billed to voters as a $33 billion project, up to 45 if you built the San Diego and Sacramento link, they've not materialized. And when you see that the price for a time went up to $98.5 billion, hence why I ran in California Senate Bill 985, it scared everybody away from this. You see, in a Baltimore to Washington proposal to do a maglev project here locally that has outside investors that want to come in on that. Nobody's touching California's high-speed rail. So in the absence of this outside investment, California has moved in many different ways to try and find other pots of money. The governor plans on diverting truck weight fees that are collected from commercial truckers away from repairing California's aging roads. Just try and drive in the right-hand lane of any freeway. I get to enjoy Interstate 5 a lot. And see what the condition of that road is. Some areas have been repaired. You know, Caltrans had a pretty good year last year. Other areas, it's still pretty rough. Or Interstate 80 near Sacramento. They're doing repairs now, but boy, the potholes on that are pretty bad. Yet we're seeing the effort by the state to shift funding away from repairing roads that everybody uses versus a project that maybe few can afford to actually use. My colleagues from the Valley here would probably tell you there's not going to be a whole lot of people that jump on high-speed rail to ride from Bakersfield to Fresno because it doesn't make any sense for them. The promise of a low-cost ticket being 85% initially of an airline ticket from LA to San Francisco or vice versa. How can that be met without having the tickets subsidized at these costs? $85 we were told, $90? It was revised later, maybe $120 when we had a hearing about it. Try $300 if it's not going to be underwritten by the taxpayers for ridership on this. How many people are going to spend $300 on that trip, other than those that might do it for the novelty of the train ride from north to south or south to north? We saw pie-in-the-sky numbers on what the amount of ridership would be, numbers that one time were greater than the entirety of Amtrak across the 48 continental states. They've had to revise them down to some other vague number. So there's not a lot of trust in anything that's being put forward by the California High-Speed Rail Authority on costs, on ridership, on impact, promises made or not made to those that are impacted in the line of many different proposals of where the route is. Yet they're still trying to move forward and start condemning people's property at who knows what price of reimbursement in order to spend as quickly as they can this $3+ billion of federal stimulus money put in place almost 5 years ago. It's really looking more like a fraudulent enterprise from what the voters saw in 2008 to now. Indeed, polling out there shows that now that people have heard about this the last couple of years and what it really means and the other choices they have to make on schools, on water, on their actual highways, but they have a whole lot different opinion on it. A lot of editorial pages around the state are saying, at the very least, if you're not going to stop it, you should put it back on the ballot. I attempted that in 2012. The mood wasn't there in the state legislature to do that. I have my colleague, former colleague there that I served with, Assemblyman Jeff Gurrell from the Santa Barbara area. He's putting forward legislation to put it back on the ballot and revote the rail. And so I hope that catches fire and that the legislature will look at this project and decide, you know, maybe that would be worth a vote of the people of California to decide if this is still a priority at these prices. So Assemblyman Gurrell has got a pretty big task to put that in front of the legislature and achieve the votes. But interestingly, still talking state politics here, but in the state Senate, to put forward the first segment of funding in late 2012, it received the bare majority of votes to fund that. In our California State Senate, there's 40 members. It got a vote of 21 to 19. All Republicans voted no, and for the Democrats, who up to that point had been pretty favorable on high-speed rail. It barely got out of the state Senate floor. I think that's saying a lot, that the opinions have changed, certainly amongst the voters. Now we just have to put the state legislature in a figurative headlock and get them to think about it and do that. So I hope Assemblyman Gurrell is successful in this measure, because it would be proper to put this back in front of the voters and ask them again, would you rather have this or water projects, highway projects, school projects, any number of things that could be done to help move California forward instead of this boondoggle that has no way of paying for itself or sustaining itself. So we see that, again, with the court handing down a ruling, that the plan has diverged so far from what was initially voted on and approved by the voters that it's now illegal. Why should state government be doing things that are illegal? Because they're right now in such a hurry to get the money spent, the federal money. If the federal money was to stop, the state money also has to, they both have to have a match with each other. If there's not the match happening, then there's giant legal problems. As Congressman Denham mentioned a while ago, what's the payback procedure if federal money is misspent, improperly spent? Does California have the capacity to do that if it doesn't meet its timelines, it doesn't meet the goals, it doesn't meet the tenets laid out in Proposition 1A of it being a true high-speed rail system all the way from San Francisco to Los Angeles, which so far that plan is not. You got to ride 3 different train types to accomplish that under this current plan. Now, we know the folks in the Bay Area and parts of Los Angeles are interested in seeing some of their tracks electrified as beneficiaries of some of the money that would be coming from this. I get that. I understand that. That probably would be a benefit for them. Some upgrades in their local infrastructure. I don't know why you couldn't support that separately from this. If it helps to have Caltrain in the Bay Area electrified, then that should be a separate question, a separate set of funding. Because right now this is illegal. The people in the Bay Area want to be part of an illegal project like this and maybe perhaps lose that funding they're depending on to electrify and upgrade their system. I don't think so, because that's a lot of money when it gets around to doing that above what's going on in the valley with the condemnation of the land and building in an area where they said they would have the least amount of resistance to the project, let alone the Bay Area and perhaps parts of North LA County. So it's very problematic. It's really time, as I proposed back in my state Senate days, to slow down the project and really get some real numbers on that. That was my first bill in the state Senate, SB 22, to say no spending, no doing anything until we have a fully vetted and thought out plan. I mean, honestly, this reminds me of Obamacare. I've been calling this around to my neighbors Obamacare Jr. because it's so poorly thought out and the plan for funding it looks largely the same, pie in the sky. Investors won't touch it. Federal government, are they going to come in and bridge the gap of the other $55 billion it's missing if we believe a $68 billion plan, or on up to the approximately 100, let alone the inflation and things that might drive a real project all the way to $150 billion? All for what? What could really be seen as an outdated technology and something that a lot of people can't afford to access, nor even make sense for them to use in short segments within the valley. Yes, it may make sense, possibly, if you had a fast train that could go all the way from San Francisco to LA and complete that. But one of the things brought up is that in order for the project to be technically legal, they would only have to send one train per day in each direction at full nonstop length. They would have other trains, perhaps, that are making all these stops, stopping at every little burg along the way. That's not high-speed rail. That's glorified Amtrak, glorified local commuters. That is not the intent of voters or anybody on this measure, or for that funding, which is scarce money these days in California, and the huge problems we have in trying to get a budget done and move eventually towards balance in our federal budget. It isn't a priority that we should be doing. So, Mr. Speaker, just want to note that, again, Congressman Denham will be having a hearing tomorrow in his Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee on rail. That'll be at 10 a.m. in Washington time, developing more on this situation. So I'd invite you to participate or watch that and expose what really needs to happen with federal funding, as well as maybe perhaps the people of California have an opportunity to weigh in on Assemblyman Gorell's proposal to have this back on the ballot and maybe perhaps shift our scarce funds to other things. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the time here tonight, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California have a motion?
I move that the House do adjourn for the night.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.
Earlier today, by voice vote, members passed a short-term continuing resolution to keep the government funded for 3 days past the January 15th deadline while avoiding another government shutdown. The long-term omnibus spending bill that would keep the government funded for the remainder of fiscal year 2014 will be debated later this week. The House returns live Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern for morning hour speeches and noon for legislative work. You can follow it all here on C-SPAN.